Hi and welcome to another tape recorder video. This time we're going to be looking at the Philips N4414. And this is a machine that's a bit unusual for me because I'm mostly interested in machines from the 1950s and the 1960s. So this is a bit unusual for me. This machine was manufactured in 1972, and as you can see it has a typical 70s styling. There's lots of metal surfaces, or surfaces that look like metal. These are actually metal on plastic. We have this type of sliders, which are sort of almost invisible. And the whole machine has a general 1970s styling. It's very square straight lines and things like that. And at this time, cassette recorders had started to make a big impact on the tape recording market. And indeed, they were used for low-cost, cheap recordings, whereas reel-to-reel still had the edge and was used for serious recording, high-end recording. But this transition was taking place from reel-to-reel to cassette, which means that the reel-to-reel recorders that existed were generally a bit more upmarket than they had been in the 1960s, for instance. So a machine like this, in this case, sports 3 motors instead of 1. There's 1 motor driving the capstan, and then 1 motor for each of the reels. Many recorders had 3 tape heads, although this is actually the lowest, the simplest of the Philips models of this type. So it actually only has an erase head and an erase head here, and a record playback head here. Other features that are typical of this type of recorder are totally electronic control. If I press the buttons, nothing happens unless the machine is actually switched on. And then there's no mechanical linkages. Everything's done either by just powering the motors, or as is the case when you press the play button, by engaging a solenoid to pull the pinch roller to the capstan. Like I said, this particular model, the N4414, was Philips' basic model in this type of upper range. So there's not a lot of features. There's a set of push buttons here for rewinding, forward wind, play, pause, record, and the stop. There's a left volume control, a right volume control. This machine is, of course, stereo. Everything in the 1970s that was considered slightly upmarket was in stereo. There's a tone control, which is normally set at maximum. That means that there's no... when you lower the tone control, you lower the treble. So with the tone control of max, that's actually a straight playback curve. And there's a recording level here. There are 2 microphone inputs, and there's a little lid to slide across that when you're not recording, so you don't get these ugly DIN connectors. And here we see another thing that's typical of Philips from those days, that there's supposed to be some sort of probably a piece of metal like this, maybe with some sort of logo on it. But it's fallen off and it's just black plastic now. The same thing here, there's supposed to be a cover covering this part here. That has at some point come off, possibly cracked, and someone's just thrown it out. And there's a piece of trim here, you probably can't see it in the video, that's missing. Things like that. That's typical of this type of styling because these parts are only glued on. So if the glue becomes dry or you happen to pull at them in some way, they tend to come off. This machine has only a single recording level meter, which is probably there for ease of use. Instead of having 1 meter for left and right, there's only 1 meter that the user has to keep an eye on. So, I should mention that this particular one has only got 2 tape speeds, 9.5 and 19 centimeters per second, and then there's a track selector. In this case, it's in the stereo position, but you can also use it as a mono recorder on the 2 individual stereo tracks, and that's very typical of reel-to-reel recorders. Very few reel-to-reel recorders, even the upmarket ones, were purely stereo. There's usually some sort of a track selector so you can use them as mono recorders, and that's a carryover from the 1960s when it was very common to use recorders like that. So people would be expected to have lots of, or people who bought this type of machine would probably be expected to have tapes at home that were mono and that would want to play them back, and perhaps even record new ones for situations where stereo wasn't important. Finally, there's a tape counter and an on-off switch. The connections for radio and amplifier, external speaker, etc. are on the back. This particular machine does have internal speakers, one on the left and the right, but normally you would probably connect this to an amplifier. The interesting thing with this one is that there's actually a handle on it, so you can carry it with you. And there is a lid that comes with it that's quite serious type of hinge up here. Normally the lid is removed. You can put it in a position where it stands up. And then, of course, this is what it looks like. It's closed, and there are locks on each side here to lock it. Normally this machine would have been now operated standing up, but since I have such a clutter in my workroom, I decided just to lie it down, which is perfectly okay. There are rubber feet on the back for that. So you can lie it down if you want, but at this time, very often reel-to-reel recorders were operated in the upright position. So we'll run a little demonstration of this particular machine. We'll put an empty reel here, and we'll put a reel of tape. You can of course use a full reel of tape, a full 7-inch reel. This happens to be my test reel because I use it for all sorts of tape recorders. So I've got a slightly smaller reel for that. And if we just fast forward, as you saw, the tape stopped immediately because there is a metal foil here, and there's a sensor here that stops the tape at the end of tape, provided that there is a metal foil there. Being a 3-motor unit, it has a fairly good winding speed, and it's fairly nice to the tape. You don't get a lot of jerky movements. It sort of stops and starts the tape quite swiftly. I can mention that Philips, being an electronics, not only manufacturing equipment like that, but also components, they were very good on motors. They have used motors that look very small, but seem to be perfectly suited for this kind of a job. So, if we press the play button, we can turn up the sound here. If you pause it, it stops the tape momentarily, and then you go on. And then, of course, there's rewind, which makes the tape go backwards. And there's an interlock, so you can't press play during a rewind. You have to press stop. But you can press rewind while the tape is playing, because that's not much of a shock. But if it doesn't have logic control, in that some machines, if you press play, they would actually stop the tape and then go into play mode. But this one, there's an interlock, so you can't do that. You have to press stop, and you have to wait for the tape to stop. I thought I'd make a small demonstration recording too as well. If we wind the tape back, we'll let the automatic stop it, and it actually stops it before it runs off the end of the reel. That's quite nice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a microphone. Now this microphone is one of my favorites, but it's not typical of this era. This is a typical 1960s microphone, but it'll do for our test. I'll plug it into the left-hand channel here, and to record on this one, you would press record, hold it down, and press play, and that starts the tape. I'm going to pause it for a moment while I set the recording level, and I don't know if you can see on the video, but here is a recording level meter, and you can probably hear a slight ringing sound. That's the sound being amplified in the speakers. So we'll turn the speakers down so I don't get any acoustic feedback. And then we press the pause button again, and we let the tape run. Now, normally you would have, for a stereo recording, you'd have 2 microphones. So I'm just going to remove this one from the left plug and plug it into the right one. And that concludes our recording. So what we'll do now is stop the tape and wind it back, and we'll listen to our recording. It's quite nice to have this automatic stop. It means you don't have to keep either looking at the tape to press it at the right moment so it doesn't run off the reel, or have it run off the reel and keep having to rethread it. So if we turn the volume up, press the pause button again, and we let the tape run. Now, normally you would have, for a stereo recording, you'd have 2 microphones. I'm just going to remove it into the right one. And that concludes our recording. So what we'll do now is stop the tape. Okay, so that concludes this demonstration of the Philips N4414. Like I said, this is a machine from the early 70s. This was Philips' basic offering in the sort of high-end segment of the market. And I must say that Philips used at this time and day and age, they used quite a lot of plastic parts, but they still managed to balance the plastic and metal. There are plastic parts in these machines, but the real serious parts, like the chassis, the pinch roller arm and things, they're made of metal. So Philips really tried to optimize production in these machines to get a machine that was a lot of value for money. And I think by and large they did succeed, but there are issues with these machines. The belts have to be replaced because they tend to melt into some sort of black goo if they're not replaced in time. And there are parts, as you can see here, that tend to fall off. But the electronics is usually very sound, and the mechanics on these is fairly simple, so there's not much that can go wrong there, except, like I said, for the belts. So, thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.